Today's lecture is the Adele Zygielbaum Memorial Lecture. Adele Zygielbaum was born in 1924 in Slavko, a small town near Krakow, Poland. She was not quite 15 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. In 1941, all the Jews in Slavko were moved into a ghetto. At 4 a.m. on June 11, 1942, the Germans forced all the residents from their homes without their belongings. The Germans separated families and committed many murders and other atrocities. Adele never saw her parents, her older brother, or younger sister again, and never learned of their fate. Adele was transported to a concentration camp in Olmütz, Germany, where she worked in a factory making wooden soles for shoes. In 1943, she was transferred to Ludwigsdorf, where she worked in an ammunition factory filling shells with gunpowder. From there, she went on to a camp in Görlitz, where she was liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Adele returned to Slavkov soon after the war. She soon reunited with her older sister, Esther, who had also survived the camps. In September of 1945, the two of them moved to Wrocław, Poland, formerly Breslau, in the former German Silesia. Shortly after arriving, she met Joseph Zygielbaum, a well-known hero of the Polish underground. They soon married. The newlyweds moved to a displaced person camp in Stuttgart, Germany, from which they emigrated to the United States in 1946. They lived in New York. Joseph worked for Forward, the newspaper of the Jewish Socialist Workers Union. Their first son, Arthur, was born early in 1947. Later that year, the family moved to Los Angeles. Their second son, Paul, was born in 1950. Adele and Joseph became American citizens in 1952. Joseph went on to become a well-known technical translator and analyst of Soviet military and space programs. Adele moved to Santa Rosa in 1999, soon after her husband's death. Adele's advice to young people was, quote, never forget what happened. Tell the story so it will never happen again. Remember the people that we've lost. Honor those who were not even privileged to have their own graves. Understand that we are not responsible for our births, but are responsible for our own conduct. Adele died in 2009. Her sons Arthur and Paul established a memorial endowment in her honor to support the work of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. Their gift has inspired hundreds and hundreds of students over the years. Okay, I'm now happy to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Jo Marie Burt is Associate Professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Virginia. She is a Senior Fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, former President of the Latin American Studies Association. In 2024 and 25, she was a Fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I hope that grant paid out fully.
Right before the deadline, right before they cut it off.
Hey, yeah, mazel tov. Burt has published widely on issues of political violence, human rights, and justice in Latin America. Her first book, Silencing Civil Society, Political Violence in the Authoritarian State in Peru, is the reason I came across her. Some of you know already that I'm married to a Peruvianist. Her current project, which informs her talk today, is titled Post-Conflict Justice, Reckoning with the Legacies of Violence in Peru, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Burt is a public-facing intellectual. She has written widely for both the English and Spanish language media. You might hear her on CNN or BBC World. She has served as an expert witness in several cases involving human rights violations before the National Criminal Court of Peru, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and immigration courts here in the United States. Her work in the latter instance has involved both cases of political asylum and suspected war criminals who face extradition or deportation from the United States. So we're very pleased to welcome Professor Burt to Sonoma State.
It's really a tremendous pleasure to be here with you today. I want to thank Stephen for the invitation. I want to thank Adele Zygielbaum and her family for endowing this memorial lecture. It's really an honor to be here in that context. And thanks to Sonoma State for bringing me here. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about my research on efforts in Guatemala to achieve justice in the aftermath of after genocide. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a framework before I get into the details of the Guatemala case. So what does the justice cascade refer to? It's a phrase that was developed by an IR scholar, an international relations scholar, Catherine Seking, in which she talks about the rise of new international norms, treaties, laws, and institutions that hold the notion of individual accountability for war crimes and other mass atrocities. The obvious precedent for all of this is Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials. But as we well know, between those trials and the 1990s, there were really very few efforts to bring war criminals to justice. And what Seking finds in her research, she developed this very interesting database where she literally counts trials across the world. And she found that there is, in fact, a cascade, an effort of countries around the world to bring war crime perpetrators to justice. Of course, this is very prominent in Latin America, more so than most regions of the world, which in and of itself is interesting, right? And she also talks about the other precedents, right, that I think are important. Just to highlight the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which I think helped enshrine in international law this idea of individual responsibility for war crimes and other crimes against humanity. The ICC was established in 2002, further consolidating this notion of individual accountability, right? And in Latin America, as I already said, there has been this uptick in domestic efforts in Latin American courts to bring those responsible for human rights violations and other war crimes to trial. The picture you see there are, well, I think it was 6 out of 9 generals from the military juntas that governed Argentina between 1976 and 1985, who were responsible for the forced disappearance of over 30,000 people. And 5 out of those 9 were convicted in 1985 and sentenced to long prison terms, although they would later be set free under a controversial pardon and then a series of amnesty laws, because these processes are never straightforward. There's also often backlash, pushing efforts to push trials backwards and prevent them from moving forward. So alongside this idea of individual criminal accountability is this concept of transitional justice, another kind of the framing concepts I want to highlight before I talk about Guatemala. And transitional justice, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of this concept. It's not a phrase that we typically hear in every day. It's kind of a term of art. But what it refers to is the different processes and mechanisms that societies that have dealt with either internal armed conflicts, wars, or authoritarian regimes to come to terms with the legacy of violence, of human rights abuses. So one of the first tools that societies developed in this concept of transitional justice was the Truth Commission. I'm sure you've all heard of that before, of truth commissions, right? Because the first Truth Commission to successfully issue a report was the one in Argentina, which has a lot to do with why there was then a trial, right? And since then, there have been truth commissions around the world investigating state crimes, but also crimes by non-state actors, right? Peru, the other country where I've done a lot of work in, the Truth Commission investigated both state violence and the violence of the insurgent Shining Path movement, for example. But other mechanisms include reparations programs, criminal trials, lustration programs, in other words, efforts to purge human rights abusers from state institutions and public office, with the idea of bringing about justice and reconciliation, both for victims and for the larger society. So my work sort of is at the intersection of these two frames. And I really do hone in on the question of criminal justice. I'm really interested in what happens inside courtrooms when victims and survivors of war crimes and other mass atrocities are able to bring perpetrators to trial. It's not a common thing at all, even though there has been, as I said, this cascade of criminal justice processes around the world. And there is a debate about how useful, how successful, how essential criminal trials are as part of transitional justice, right? So for some people, it's absolutely essential, right? Victims have an absolute right, in their view, to accountability as well to truth, and trials are an important element of achieving that. It contributes to the consolidation of the rule of law, to collective memory, and it's restorative and reparative for victims, according to those who favor criminal justice trials. Others, however, think that they are inherently flawed. They're expensive, which they are. They can sometimes focus not exclusively, but excessively on perpetrators, sometimes meaning that can be re-victimizing for survivors and those who've been subjected to human rights abuses. And they're often limited because they're selective almost by nature, right? Prosecutions can never, it's very rare for a country to be able to bring to trial all those implicated in human rights abuses. In Latin America, the only country that I know that even comes close to that is Argentina. And it is the country with the most robust transitional justice and criminal accountability process. Other countries like Peru and Guatemala have done a lot, but it is by no means, the universe of perpetrators is no means, by any means, is being prosecuted in those places. So there is an effort by scholars like me who are trying to bring these two points of view into dialogue with each other. That it's not really a Manichaean situation, right? Trials are flawed. They can be re-victimizing, but they can also be restorative and reparative for victims. They can be both. Sometimes they are profoundly problematic, and sometimes they achieve incredible things for victims. So it's our job as researchers, right, to look at trials, to try to understand when and why they are restorative and reparative, and when and why they are re-victimizing, right? When they contribute to collective memory and helping us reframe what we knew about past conflict, or when it just feeds into old narratives, right? So they can be both, right? So that's part of what I'm trying to do in my research. So now I'm going to turn to Guatemala. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. Can you just remind me how long I have? And I don't see a watch on my phone.
Yeah, you have another 45 minutes or 50 minutes. Okay,
great. Can you just kind of signal to me when I'm at 40 minutes?
Yeah.
When I have like 10 minutes left? Okay, good. Because I'll just go on for hours. You won't like that. Okay, so I just want to give you a little reference point. Probably you all know where Guatemala is. There are a lot of Guatemalans living here. As there are in my hometown in Washington, D.C. And that is largely because of the war of the 1980s. Over 1 million Guatemalans, the estimates are between 1 million and 1.5 million Guatemalans were forcibly displaced in a country at the time that had 9 million people. So that is a lot of people being forced to leave the country because of the war. And a lot of them came to the U.S. Some stayed in Mexico, and a few other places, but there's a lot of Guatemalans living here. So as you can see, it's pretty close to the U.S. It's the largest country in Central America, has a vibrant economy, although it still suffers crushing poverty and inequality. I'm going to give just a quick timeline to help us understand the time period that we're talking about. So Guatemala attained independence from Spain in 1821. I'm not going to talk about that history, even though it's fascinating. I'm going to start with the period of 1944 to 1954, when Guatemala experienced a period called the Democratic Spring. Prior to 44, pretty much since independence, Guatemala had been ruled by a small landed elite, backed by foreign investors and governments who leveraged the Guatemalan army to keep civil unrest and the majority indigenous population under check. The country was marked, as I already said, by extreme levels of inequality, land concentration, and the historic marginalization and political exclusion of the indigenous population, right? So Juan José Arevalo, who became president in 1944, who sort of led this democratic spring, this process of profound democratic reform, and then was followed by Jacobo Arbenz, who instilled a land reform program that generated the ire of the United Fruit Company, a US-based company. You may have heard about this. If you've never read the book Bitter Fruit, run to your bookstore or open your Kindle, your Audible, whatever, and download it, because it is an amazing book and it's part of Guatemalan history, but it's also part of our history, American history, because the United States government, cajoled by the shareholders of the United Fruit Company, who also happened to be the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the Secretary, the head of the CIA, the other Dulles. I'm forgetting his first name. Anyway, the Dulles brothers. Alan Dulles, thank you. They encouraged the US government to view the Arbenz government as essentially a communist government that needed to be overthrown. This was, of course, the throes of the height of the Cold War. I think we had just overthrown the Schar of Iran in 1953, right? Did we overthrow the Schar? We overthrew some government in Iran, and then the CIA-backed coup happened in Guatemala in 1954. After 1954, you saw a series of military-led governments, one more repressive than the next. And this would eventually give rise to a series of rebel movements, armed and unarmed movements that were trying to change the situation in Guatemala. And it's important to note that there were other similar revolutionary movements in Central America, especially in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Also countries governed by small landed elites, dictatorial, highly repressive, highly exclusionary regimes. The Guatemalan armed conflict, the period that historians usually talk about is 1960 to 1966, which is a really long period. It's 36 years. But the worst period of state violence was between 78 and 85, when the rebel movements were at their strongest and most organized. And that was the period in which the genocide occurred. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Peace accords were eventually signed in 1996. The Cold War wound down. The U.S. was trying to wrap up all of its wars in Central America. There were peace accords signed in El Salvador as well in 92. And the U.S. sort of went elsewhere. In the aftermath of the peace accords, there were two truth commissions in Guatemala. The one in 1999, the UN Commission for Historical Clarification, was the official truth commission that was created as a result of the peace accords. It was an agreement by the state and the URNG rebel group. As part of its agreement with Guatemala, decided to create a truth commission to investigate the crimes of the past. However, the Catholic Church in Guatemala, which was sort of a liberation theology, progressive church, was very concerned that the agreement establishing the Truth Commission essentially was very limiting. It said, for example, that they could not use any of the information that came out of the Truth Commission for criminal investigations, for trials, for example. It only established, I think, a 1.5 year period for its work. And there were other limitations that the Catholic Church was very concerned about, that it felt was more likely to induce impunity than any real reckoning, right, with those responsible for atrocities. So the Catholic Church launched its own Truth Commission report, or investigation that then, I guess, issued a report. And it was a really interesting process, very grassroots. They trained indigenous community leaders who then went or sort of fanned around the country, conducting interviews with survivors and others in indigenous languages. And then they wrote this big report called the REMI, the Recuperation of Historical Memory report. The 2 days after that report was released, the Archbishop of Guatemala, Juan Gerardi, who was in charge of the Remy project, was brutally murdered in his home, as it turns out, by members of the Presidential Guard. They did not like his report. They did not like what he had to say. And clearly this was a message for the UN Commission, right? To also calm your jets and not produce a hard-hitting report like the Remy report. Interestingly, though, it had the opposite effect, right? For reasons I haven't quite yet figured it.
Bless you.
So instead of producing a more moderate less hard-hitting report, it was the contrary. The UN Commission for Historical Clarification report is widely seen as, I think, one of the most powerful Truth Commission reports, not only at the time, but sort of looking forward. Because it didn't only look at specific instances of violence, which is what Truth Commissions up until then typically did. Instead, it also looked at the history of Guatemala. It looked at why there was such violence. It looked at the history of racism and how that racism fed into what it called acts of genocide against indigenous populations in different regions of the country. So there are these two very powerful Truth Commission reports that for victims meant quite a bit, and especially in terms of their hope for bringing perpetrators to justice, there was some hope that they could use these reports. And there's some complications in how that came to be that I could talk about in Q&A, but I'm gonna sort of glide over that for the moment. I'm gonna jump forward to 2007. Because in 2007, something very unique and interesting happened in Guatemala. And that is the creation of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. That was also a UN-sponsored intervention in which this body called the CICIG was designed to set up an independent agency in Guatemala to help strengthen judicial and prosecutorial independence in Guatemala. And the background to that is that at that point, between the end of the war and 2007, sort of those 12 or so years after the war, the country had only gotten more violent, less rule of law, attacks against human rights defenders and others, and there was growing concern. Homicide rates were skyrocketing, so there's growing concern by the international community. And the international, as we'll see, excuse me, the ICC would come to play a really important role in making criminal justice possible. They didn't do the work. They were actually its mandate excluded, did not include work on human rights violations from the war period, right? That was not part of their mandate. And yet the work that the CC did would help strengthen both prosecutors, the process of selecting independent prosecutors and judges, and thereby help strengthen the judicial system in Guatemala. So we'll talk about that again in a bit. And then I'm going to jump forward to talk about the Justice Spring, which is the core of my research. I'm looking at it basically a 10-year period, and unfortunately it has come to an end, and I'll talk about that in the backlash. But there was a 10-year period, more or less, when independent prosecutors and independent judges, I wouldn't say they completely dominated both the prosecutor's office and the judicial system, but they were in ascendance, right? And they were prioritizing investigations and prosecutions for work that had occurred during the war. They were also investigating corruption and organized crime and structures left over from the war that had become deeply enmeshed in these structures, right? That were involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, and other myriad forms of organized crime, including sort of capturing different state institutions and stealing money from the state. So in this Justice Spring period, You had, and I'm going to show you a table in a minute so you can see all the different convictions that have been handed down. There were a number of trials, and probably the most important, the one I'm probably going to talk most about today, is the genocide trial against the former dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, which occurred in 2013. And then the timeline kind of comes to a sad conclusion with 2019, when CICIG was forced to close down. Attacks against accountability efforts begin to intensify, and literally judges and prosecutors who at one point were ascendant and leading these processes are forced out. They're forced into exile. Many of them live, they're my neighbors in Washington, D.C. Some of them live in Mexico, some of them live in Costa Rica, Spain. Independent journalists were arrested, forced to shut down their newspapers, and so forth. So the whole process has been under enormous stress in the last few years. And though we currently have a president who was elected a couple of years ago on an anti-corruption platform, the actors who have pushed this backlash still have a lot of power in Guatemala. And I can talk more about that in a bit. Let's talk about quickly what the UN Commission for Historical Clarification found to give you all a sense of the genocide in Guatemala. So, and remember again, this was a country at the time of 9 million people. So the Truth Commission found that 200,000 people, mostly unarmed civilians, were killed or forcibly disappeared. Of the 200,000, 45,000 were forcibly disappeared, meaning they were taken from their homes, their place of work, from the street, and then they were never heard from again, taken by state agents and never heard from again. Their destiny denied, unknown, right? And the families therefore have no knowledge of what happened to them. Between 1 and 1.5 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes, as I mentioned a moment ago. The Truth Commission documented 626 massacres. And 400 indigenous Mayan indigenous villages that were completely wiped off the face of the earth and simply stopped existing because of the scorched earth policies of the Guatemalan army. 83% of the victims were indigenous people. And I think at the time, only around 60% of the population was indigenous. So you see there's a heavy bias there. And there was massive use of torture and sexual violence, especially against women and girls. The Truth Commission attributed 93% of these abuses to government forces, military, police, and paramilitary forces. 3% were attributed to guerrilla groups. In other words, guerrilla groups did also commit acts of violence. And those were documented by the Truth Commission. But as we can see, it's a very small number. It does not, excuse them by any means, but it shows how the majority of abuses were committed by government forces. And all of these things together led the commission to determine that the military was responsible for acts of genocide against 5 different ethnic groups in 4 regions of the country in the years 1978 to 1985. So as I talked about when I was talking about the timeline, so though peace accords were signed in 1996, and these were very robust peace accords on paper, right? They included reform of the armed forces. They talked about land reform for indigenous people. They talked about respecting, creating changes in the Constitution to respect indigenous communities, indigenous law, indigenous culture and heritage, and so forth, and so on. This was not respected by any stretch of the imagination in practice, right? And in terms of war crimes, impunity became the norm, meaning no one virtually was being investigated or prosecuted, right? In the face of this impunity, however, survivors and victims of families of victims continue to demand truth and justice. They documented human rights violations. They filed complaints before Guatemalan courts, and they even started looking outside their own borders for opportunities to bring their cases to court in places like Spain. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And you'll see this very interesting process that starts to happen where the actions of survivors in international courts starts to have starts to be successful and then starts to create pressure back in Guatemala and pressuring Guatemalan courts to respond after not having done so for so many years. So just, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. So in 1999, anybody know who this is? Oh, I guess I already told you who it is. Nobel laureate Rigoberta Menchú. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992, the year of the indigenous person. That was the 500 years of the so-called the Spanish conquest, right? In 1999, she filed a complaint against the military high command of Guatemala for genocide and crimes against humanity in Spain, or the Spanish National Court. Does anyone know why she would do that? Something very important happened the year before that led her to make that decision to do that. Anybody know what happened the year before? In London? Anybody? Anybody know who General Augusto Pinochet is?
No.
Ah, right. The former dictator of Chile, right, was in London for back surgery. And what happened to him? He was arrested because Spain, a judge in Spain, right, called for his extradition based on the concept of universal jurisdiction, which basically it's an international norm based on a series of treaties, right, that establishes that states that are parties to these treaties can prosecute different war crimes, torture, forced disappearance, whatever, regardless of where the crime took place and regardless of whether the perpetrator are nationals of that state, right? So under that logic, Judge Garzón, the prosecuting judge in this that was investigating the case, said, I have jurisdiction over Pinochet. So London, you have to extradite him to Spain so he can be put on trial. And so the law lords in London, they went back and forth. Eventually, there's a whole couple of really good books about this that I highly recommend. Philippe Sands, anybody knows Philippe Sands? Mm-hmm. Scholar and lawyer of the Holocaust and so on, the rat line East-West. Well, he just came out with a book called Londres 73, which is about Pinochet and Nazis in Chile. It's a very interesting book. Anyway, so in the end, the law lords agree that the principle of universal jurisdiction stands and they approve the request to extradite Pinochet. Of course, Pinochet never is extradited. The politics gets in the way, right? The Tony Blair government decides that it doesn't want to deal with that. And so they, using the argument of humanitarian concerns, they send Pinochet back to Chile. But the principle stands. The principle of universal jurisdiction stands. And so Rigoberta Menchú says, well, in Guatemala, no one's doing anything to prosecute or even investigate the generals of the genocide. So I'm going to bring charges in Spain. And for years, nothing happened. The case sat dormant. The courts in Spain debated whether or not Spain had jurisdiction. And one court said no, another court said yes. And it kind of took quite a while until 2005 or 6, when, so literally like almost 6 years went by, right? Until a court said, no, we do have, I think the Supreme Court was, we do have jurisdiction. And then a judge was assigned the case, and Judge, I'm going to forget his name. Santiago Pedras, that's his name. He begins his investigation. And he requests that Rios Montt, the dictator of Guatemala, and several of the generals named in Rigoberta Menchú's suit be extradited to Spain to stand trial. And so the Guatemalan Constitutional Court then has to make a decision. Are they going to, I mean, they can't just ignore this, right? This is a formal request from the Spanish government. Mm-hmm. And eventually the Constitutional Court of Guatemala says, no, you don't have jurisdiction. We will make sure he's prosecuted. No, they are prosecuted here in Guatemala. So it generated pressure in Guatemala, right, to begin investigating these cases. Of course, at this point, Rios Montt is a congressman, elected congressman, so he has immunity. So he's not being investigated at all. Just to keep that in mind, right? At the same time, alongside Rigoberta's case in Spain, local organizations in Guatemala, primarily the Association for Justice and Reconciliation, which is an organization comprised of survivors of the genocide in several different regions of the country, they filed charges in Guatemalan courts. So there's this two-track system going on, right? So Burt is pursuing the case in Spain, and local organizations are pursuing justice in Guatemala with the hope that someday these two things are gonna come together. And they do. But before that happens, right? I should also say that Pedras, the judge in Spain, even though the Constitutional Court told him that Spain doesn't have jurisdiction, and they refused to extradite the generals. He said, well, I think my courts have said I do have jurisdiction, and so I am gonna pursue my investigation. And so he actually took testimony from victims, from expert witnesses, from forensic experts. And so you had, like, in a courtroom in Spain for several months, like a mini trial going on. And though it didn't end in a resolution, because without a defendant, you can't issue a verdict, at least in Spain, you can't, right? But it still was a very important pressure point for Guatemala, right? So that's happening. At the same time, you have the Inter-American Court on Human Rights issuing a series of sentences against the state of Guatemala for human rights abuses. So you can see here, there's 16 sentences. Now, some of these are more recent, obviously, but these early sentences, you see 2001, 2002, 2000, almost one a year, and then 2002, there's 3, and so on. The Inter-American Court for Human Rights is kind of a court of last resort, right? It's where, if I'm a victim of a human rights abuse in Guatemala and my judicial system is not investigating seriously my case, and it doesn't have to be I'm a victim of massacre. Lots of, if my rights that are enshrined in the Inter-American Convention on Civil and Political Liberties are being violated, I can use the Inter-American Court if domestically the courts aren't doing their job. Right. And so this is what's happening. Victims are taking their cases to the Inter-American. It's very costly. It's very time consuming. First, it has to go through the Inter-American Commission, which studies it. It asks the state to respond. It takes years. This is not an easy process. So this is something of a miracle that there are 16 rulings against the state of Guatemala, each one of these brought by victims. And some of them, you know, like the Plan de Sanchez massacre, that's considered like the opening act in the genocide. 400 people killed in a matter of a couple days in 1978. There was a ruling in that case in 2004. And the thing you have to keep in mind is that if you are a state that is a signatory to these treaties of the Organization of American States, the the American Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and all the other treaties that they have, you are obligated to respect and fulfill the orders of the Inter-American Court. It's not optional. Now, we know one of the problems of international law is that there's no way to enforce. So if Guatemala ignores a ruling, it's not like there's a way the court, I mean, there are things the court can do. It's mainly pressure, cajoling, issuing reports. Maybe they might, you know, say something to the IMF about, or the World Bank about a loan, you know what I mean? There might be pressure of that kind, but there's no real enforcement mechanism. And yet it's become over the years a very important tool that victims, as well as prosecutors and judges, can use when they're trying to bring about accountability. The next thing that happens in Guatemala is all these international efforts by victims to push the justice system forward are happening. You start to see changes in the Guatemalan legal system. There's a new generation of leaders who come into organizations, into institutions like the Attorney General's office, like the Supreme Court, different levels of courts. And probably the best known is Claudia Paz, the first female Attorney General that Guatemala had between 2010 and 2014. She was a human rights lawyer. And she spearheaded a campaign to prioritize investigation into these war crimes, from the conflict period. She also tried to combat organized gangs, drug trafficking, other forms of organized crime. She wasn't, uniquely focused on this problem of impunity. She was trying to battle impunity writ large, but she did not ignore, right, the war crimes issue, which is one of the things I think that made her so well known and so, at least among certain Guatemalans, so well loved and clearly hated by other Guatemalans, right? And she's the person who, under her term as Attorney General, Rios Montt was charged for genocide and prosecuted. The CC, which I mentioned also earlier, had already come into being by the time Claudia, in fact, the CC made it possible for Claudia to be selected as Attorney General. I think without CC, most likely that wouldn't have happened, right? The CC helped establish new mechanisms for selecting attorneys general, judges, prosecutors, and other key positions in the justice sector. The CC also helped create the high-risk courts in Guatemala, which would become sort of islands of excellence, right? Where judges were given extra layers of protection. So were prosecutors and witnesses. They were given extra training. And these became the places where these high risk human rights trials would take place in the subsequent years. So here you can see it's not, I mean, if I had side by side a list of all the convictions in Argentina, you all would be like, that's nothing, okay? Just to be clear. But for Guatemala, where it was like almost total impunity, this is not nothing. And it represents almost 4,000 victims, right? These are a handful of convictions, a couple of acquittals. There was an acquittal in 2023, ironically, of a case that had already convicted several perpetrators in 3 different trials. So you begin to see, this is in 2023, you begin to see things moving backwards, right? And there's also an interesting thing. I'm just going to kind of flag this here, and we'll talk about it again a bit later. The early trials, up until the 2013 Rios Montt trial, the Zygielbaum trial, that's the Rios Montt trial. Those earlier trials are mostly focusing on low-level perpetrators. They're focusing on civil defense patrolmen, in other words, local members of the community, mostly indigenous men who were forced to participate in civil defense patrols controlled by the army, low-level soldiers, and sometimes, low-ranking, mid-ranking military officials, but mostly low-level perpetrators. And so in the early years, clearly the military and their allies are furious and very upset about all of this. And there's an organization called AVEMIGUA, the Association of Guatemala Military Veterans, that was created to oppose the peace accords. Yes, you heard that right. They were created to oppose the peace accords. And they, of course, have opposed all these trials. They opposed the CICIG and so forth. But it was really them. They were the ones out there complaining, protesting, saying that these were, these trials were being organized by terrorists or guerrillas or communists, and that this was, threatening Guatemalan stability and security and so forth. But the trials were moving forward, right? And then 2013, the genocide trial happened. The general, the big man, Rios Montt, he was no longer, he'd stepped down as a congressperson at the end of 2011. And literally within a couple of weeks, the Attorney General's office filed charges against him. He had to come in, he had to be interrogated, they took his picture, and the trial against him, it would take another 1.5 years for the actual trial to start, but the proceedings, began. And that is when you start to see a much more united front develop between not just the military, but also members of the economic elite saying, okay, this is a problem for us, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail now about the genocide trial, because although, as I'll tell you, I'll kind of give out the spoiler now. Rios Montt was convicted. He was found guilty. of genocide and crimes against humanity and sentenced to 80 years in prison. But 10 days later, the Constitutional Court overturned the verdict. So, right, good and bad, right? So I'm going to give away the punchline, but it's still a hugely important case. And I'm going to try to explain to you why I think that's the case, even though the verdict was essentially tossed out in a move that I think was illegal, but we'll come to that in a minute. So what's one of the extraordinary things about this case, obviously I've already hinted at it, is that it's the first time that senior government officials in Guatemala are put on trial for the genocidal counterinsurgency policies of the 1980s. And Rios Montt is the gentleman here with the glasses and the mustache. The gentleman with his hands like this, that's his military intelligence, the military intelligence chief, Rodriguez Sanchez. Spacing out his first name. Also important because it's the first time ever that a domestic court of law has prosecuted a senior government official for the crime of genocide. International courts have prosecuted the crime of genocide up until this point, but never a domestic court. So that is groundbreaking. And that it was little tiny Guatemala that did that is really quite something, right? Over 100 survivors of the Maya Ixil genocide participated in the hearings as witnesses and testified, including 10 women survivors of sexual violence. There was tremendous pressure as these proceedings were unfolding. There were threats against the prosecutors. There were threats against the judges. There were threats against the lawyers. There were threats against the survivors. In fact, the whole case was supposed to start in August of 2013, and it was moved up to March 2013 by the tribunal because of fears of physical attacks against the tribunal and others. So there was tremendous pressure ongoing as the proceedings were unfolding in Guatemala. And nevertheless, the survivors showed up. The indigenous Maya Ixil people showed up and testified in the court. Their testimonies were supplemented by numerous other elements, including military documents, U.S. declassified documents, forensic evidence, expert reports, and so forth, that helped demonstrate that Rios Montt was responsible for committing genocide against the Maya Ixil. I should note just a couple brief things. The reason that the trial is focused only on the genocide against the Ixil is because the prosecutor's office determined that there was enough evidence to proceed in a criminal trial in this case. That some of the other cases where, for example, the Truth Commission had determined that there had also been genocide, the evidence was not as ready, right, to bring it to trial. And they wanted to move forward quickly. And they realized, I think Talia Paz and her team realized that they had a window of opportunity. And so they had to be as precise as they could. And that's when I said earlier, one of the problems with trials is their selectivity. You see a very clear example of that here, right? Another thing is that initially there were, I can't remember the number, it's like 8 or 9 generals who were named in this case. But because they focused on just the Maya Ixil region and just during the Rios Montt period, certain other generals fell off from the case. And then others who should have been in the case, like his Minister of Defense, Mejia Victores, got sick, was declared, I think he had dementia, another one died. And so it ended up being just Rios Montt and Rodriguez Sanchez. And you'll recall that I told you that the Commission for Historical Clarification had determined in its report that the Guatemalan state had committed acts of genocide. And one of the reasons I think this trial was so important, that though we knew, right, we had the Truth Commission's report, a very extensive report, by the way, it's something like 4,000 pages. And the report on the Ixil genocide is very detailed. But The Truth Commission didn't engage in any public hearings of any kind. There was no audio visual record, no recordings of the people who testified before the commission. There was no public rendering of what happened aside from what was in that report. And so the visual impact of survivors of state violence sitting in a courtroom face to face with the men they believe responsible for the genocide against them and their people was incredibly powerful, right? The audio impact of survivors testifying with Rios Montt and his chief of military intelligence sitting right there, right in front of them, was absolutely incredibly powerful. Having like this woman here is one of the one of the SSU authorities. And they accompanied the survivors every day during the trial, throughout the 3 or so months that it occurred. A sort of symbolic affirmation of Indigenous authority, culture, autonomy in a country where being Indigenous was almost a crime. So there's something deeply symbolic about this trial taking place. And I should also note that during the trial, as it was ongoing, I was a trial observer during this process. I worked with a team of other observers organized by the International Justice Monitor, which was a project of the Open Society Institute. So I was there for 3 different phases of the trial, including the last week and when the verdict was handed down. And there was incredible tension, as I mentioned earlier. And the fact that the trial was able to culminate in a verdict, right, in and of itself is an incredible milestone, even though we know that it would eventually be overturned. And really just a few days later, it would be overturned. It was sort of a disruption in the long-standing power dynamics of Guatemala, right? With the most marginalized, the most oppressed members of society facing down, staring down, right? The people they believe responsible for the genocide. So I can't stress enough the importance of that, even in the midst of all this, the tension, the attacks. There was, I should mention this too, there were also a series of, sometimes they were statements taken out in the press. Sometimes they were anonymous circulars that just started to circulate throughout the city, calling, for example, with pictures of Attorney General Paz y Paz, the lead prosecutor in the case, Orlando Lopez, some of the other lawyers in the case. One of them even had the ambassador of the US at the time who was supportive of the trial. He came to the trial a few times and saying that they were all part of a communist conspiracy designed to undermine the Guatemalan military and destroy the peace that Guatemala had so diligently constructed. So there, as I said, there was an incredible amount of pressure placed on those who were participating in this trial. Here we see Rios Montt. Early on in the trial, he was offered an opportunity to speak to the court. He denied. He refused. And then just before the trial was to conclude, he changed his mind and asked the court for an opportunity to address the court. And the court could have said no. Procedurally, it was not his time to speak, right? At that time had already passed, but it decided to allow him to speak. It was a kind of a short, rambling defense of his government, of his idea of Guatemalanness, in which it was actually very powerful to listen to him talk about his doctrine of Guatemalanness, in which he talked about how the indigenous communities who had their own languages, their own ethnic cultures and norms and so forth, and how that was undermining the ability to construct the Guatemalan nation state. So it's almost full-throated defense of his genocidal policies, right? But coded in this phrase Guatemalanness. And here you see a little quote from him. I never authorized, I never proposed, I never ordered acts against any ethnic or religious group. He and his lawyers claim that when the military engaged in scorched earth policies or massacres, they were trying to kill guerrillas. And if there were indigenous people in the way, well, that was a bummer, but that wasn't their intention. That was sort of his argument, right? And of course, the court did not buy it. This is Judge Jasmine Barrios, one of the most brave judges. She's one of the few judges who has refused to leave Guatemala. And she's been involved in a number of these high-profile human rights cases, including the Girardi case, the archbishop who was killed in 98. She presided over the genocide trial, and here she is reading out the verdict on the last day of the trial. And I love this image because you see Rios-Montt he's sweating. He realizes that he's being convicted. And throughout the proceedings, from the day he was indicted until this moment, his lawyers were engaged in what we call malicious litigation. They filed over 100 appeals or legal motions with the sole aim of obstructing the proceedings and getting it thrown out somehow, whether it was an effort to have the judges recused, claiming that his due process rights had been violated, to other random things, usually having no basis in law. As I said earlier, he was convicted and sentenced to 80 years in prison. And here you have members of the Ixil community coming outside of the Supreme Court building shortly after the verdict was read aloud and celebrating their victory. And you see the El Periódico from the next morning showing Rios-Montt had been declared guilty. I already mentioned the backlash, but I kind of want to highlight this one document. This document was published in all of Guatemala's newspapers, and unlike some of the other circulars that were out there that were clearly the work of the Guatemalan military or close allies of the Guatemalan military that just fell into that kind of simplistic logic of, oh, they're communists, oh, they're terrorists. This document was signed by 12 highly respected public figures, including several who played a role in the peace accords, including a former vice president. And they also argued that the genocide trial was threatening peace in Guatemala. And they even went further. They claimed that the case was based on a legal fabrication and was not just an indictment against Rios-Montt or even against the Guatemalan military, but against the Guatemalan state itself, and then it represented a danger for Guatemalan democracy and peace. So you can see that there was intense pressure from different quarters, not just from the military, over this trial. And indeed, so the verdict was handed down on May 10th. The next day, Rios-Montt was sent to a military prison, and his lawyer convened a protest of former civil defense patrolmen. So thousands of these former civil defense patrolmen show up in front of the prison protesting Rios-Montt's arrest. And the powerful association of business interests, sort of the representative of the Guatemalan oligarchy called CACIF, held a press conference in which they called for the annulment of the genocide verdict. The CACIF press conference was kind of incredible because they said very plainly that they thought that the trial court was overly ideological, meaning that they were communist, right? And subject to pressure and interference by unnamed international organizations. I would later be called on the carpet by CACIF. So I don't know if they thought me and my organization WOLA, because we wrote a lot about the trial. We wrote about the trial as it was ongoing, and then we later wrote about the overturning of it. That the international organizations had unduly influenced the trial court. And they launched a publicity campaign asserting that the genocide verdict would undermine investor confidence in Guatemala because it equated the country with Nazi Germany and the Rwandan genocide. Yes, you heard that right. And And, 10 days later, and they called very explicitly on the Constitutional Court, which is kind of like our Supreme Court, the body, the highest legal body in the land. They called on the Constitutional Court to overturn the verdict. The court didn't exactly, overturn the verdict. What they did was, and legally, that should have gone to an appeals court. Instead, the Constitutional Court stepped in and they said, well, we find that there was a due process violation here regarding the way the court handled the defense attorney being present in the room or not. And so from that day forward, so April 19th, just a couple weeks before the verdict was handed down, we're going to suspend those hearings, which in effect vacated the verdict. So without even acknowledging that the verdict had been handed down, right, by a court, they just annulled several hearings, thereby basically saying there's no such thing as the genocide conviction. And it was, the lawyers and the prosecutor's office filed appeals. They tried to get that ruling overturned, but they really didn't have anywhere to go. They did file a complaint to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, but my understanding is that hasn't really gone anywhere. So Rios Montt was returned to his prior condition, which was not free. It was house arrest, right? And so, because he still had an indictment. And so they had to carry out a second trial, a new trial against him with new judges. All of the victims had to testify again. And there was, of course, some doubt as to whether they would be too intimidated and scared to do so. But in fact, they did. Instead of being intimidated, they said, no, this is our right. They were almost empowered, and in a way that I found very powerful and uplifting, I guess. I guess that trial started, the retrial started in 2017, and Rios Montt passed away in 2018 before the court could hand down the verdict. So he died in the middle of that retrial. And in the meantime, there was a huge backlash against these efforts. Claudia Paz y Paz was removed 6 months early from her position. A lot of people left the country. But I only have a few minutes to go through what I thought I would have a little bit more time to do this. But the long and short of it is there was a hiccup at that moment after the genocide trial. But in 2015, there were mass protests in Guatemala over corruption. And the president and the vice president were forced out of office. And it kind of ushered in a whole new pro-impunity coalition. And so these trials also continued. And literally in 2014, after this verdict was overturned, I and pretty much everyone I worked with thought, well, that's the transitional justice moment in Guatemala is over, but it was not over. And there would be a series of other trials that would occur in Guatemala over the next several years. One of the most powerful was the Sepultarco trial. I'm not going to have time to talk about it in any length here, but this was a trial that was focused on 15 Kekchi women that you see right there. The army came into their town, convened by the local landowners who were upset because their husbands were involved in an effort to reclaim lands that they had said had been stolen from them by local landed elites. And the land elites handed over lists to the army of men that they wanted to get rid of. Those men were killed or disappeared. Then their women were raped, and then they were forced into a years-long system of sexual and domestic servitude at a military base called the Sepultarco military base, which you can see this is the ruins of that military base. Now it's used as a market. That's what it looked like several years ago. The Sepultarco military base, there are actually military documents that designated this military base as a recreation zone where soldiers could rest and have contact with the feminine sex. And we all know what that means, right? Here you see the lawyers and public prosecutors, and behind them the women. Petrona Chuk was one of the survivors to testify in the court. And in the end, two military men And so they received, I go back to mention, and Jody Williams, another Nobel Prize laureate. The two military officials on trial in this case were convicted for crimes against humanity against the women for the murder of a woman and her two daughters, who the woman resisted, which is why she was killed, and the forced disappearance of 7 community leaders. The forensic investigators actually dug up the bodies of, I think it was 55 or 56 people, but the soil in this part of Guatemala is very damp, and it was impossible for them to take DNA for most of the bodies. They were only able to identify 7. One of them was the wife of one of the complainants in the Satisfies case, which is incredibly powerful. And they were convicted to 120 to 240 years in prison. Here you see the women. And the reason they have their heads covered with scars is to protect their identities, to avoid photojournalists from taking, umpteen numbers of pictures of them, protecting their dignity. The court allowed that, but I just love this picture. I don't know who the photographer is, of the women after the verdict came down, taking off their scarves and showing their faces. I just think that is such a beautiful image. And then another case I just want to briefly touch upon before I wrap up and move to Q&A is the Molina Tyson trial. This is a terrible case in which a woman, a 21-year-old woman, Emma Molina Tyson, was detained by the military. They found her with documents connecting her to one of the insurgent groups. She was taken to a military base, interrogated, tortured, gang raped. 9 days later, she manages to escape. The story of that is fascinating. I don't have time to tell it here. She escapes and she survives. She now lives in exile in Costa Rica. The military, of course, this is like a total security breach to have someone you believe is an insurgent escape from the military, right? From the military detention center. So they go looking for her. They go looking for her at her parents' house back in Guatemala City. This all occurred in Quetzaltenango. They go to her mother's house. She's, of course, not there. She's with her comrades in a safe house who eventually get her to Mexico and then to Costa Rica later on. At the home are her mother and her 14-year-old brother, Marco Antonio. And so, not finding Emma, they decide to disappear Marco Antonio, who to this day has not been found. We don't know where he is. We don't know what happened to him. So the trial was for both of those things. It was for what happened to Emma and what happened to Marco Antonio. And one of the things that was so powerful about this case was that on trial were senior military officials. The guy to the far left was the former head of the Guatemalan army, the man who designed the scorched earth counterinsurgency, Benedicto Lucas Garcia. His brother was the dictator from 78 to 82, Romeo Lucas Garcia. And then the other guys, 4 other senior military officials. Along with him, 4 out of the 5 were convicted and sentenced to 58 years in prison in this case. And the reason I wanted to just mention this case at the end, this is Emma's mother identifying the man who disappeared her son. Like, this is the guy, right? This is the guy. And he was the same guy who had been in charge of the torture of Emma. And this is the reason I wanted to include this quote. I wanted to talk about what it meant for Emma to participate in a trial, to seek justice in a Guatemalan court of law, and what got her to that point. Because up until this point, Emma had she told me this herself, I'd kind of written off Guatemala. I lived in Costa Rica. Guatemala for me was just very painful. First of all, because of what they did to me, and then because of what they did to my brother, which I believed was my fault, right? She blamed herself. And she told me that when she saw the women in the Shield trial, and then in the Sepulsarco trial, testifying about the sexual abuse that they endured at the hands of the Guatemalan military, which is what she also endured, she said, oh my God, they can do it. Why can't I? Right? And so she decides to participate in this trial and try to bring about justice for her and for her brother. And maybe that would help them find her brother. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. But I think that these cases are examples. Even though the genocide trial was overturned, the verdict rather was overturned, these are very powerful examples of how trials can help rewrite the narratives that are typically written by the powerful about what happened during the conflict, right? They give, typically, as we know, trials can prioritize, emphasize the perpetrators. And yet in Guatemala, the survivors were able to take a central stage. So that can be done in a court of laws. It's not easy, but Guatemala shows that it is possible. And I think it's also very interesting that the sexual violence cases have completely destabilized the military narrative, claiming that any acts of violence were justified in the name of combating subversion. You can't really justify raping a woman, and that somehow is saving your country from communism, right? So there's something very powerful about how these sexual violence cases have helped destabilize that narrative. And as I said, Marco Antonio remains missing. I can maybe talk about that later. I just want to end with these last two slides. This little quote from Emma: the fact that our case has been heard in court has in itself been hearing. It has given us the opportunity to tell our truth and ask for the justice we deserve. She said this in her closing statements before the court. And then here we are. We were in Mexico just a couple of years ago. And I always take the opportunity to talk to her about her experience. And I can't remember if it was this time or a time earlier that I spoke to her, but she said this to me: learning from Seposarco changed my heart because they suffered the same thing I did. They suffered longer than I did. They had the courage and the strength to testify. And I thought if they could do it, so could I. And that changed me completely. So I think it's just a very powerful example of how bringing cases to trial can be empowering for victims. Of course, I'm now leaving out the bad part of the story, which is the backlash. And I'm going to save that part for the Q&A if you want to explore that. Because I really want to emphasize what is so powerful about the transitional justice process, the criminal trials in Guatemala. The backlash has always been there, right? The military, from the moment these trials started, have been trying to stop them. It's just that in the course of the efforts to prosecute other crimes, including organized crime, crimes involving the elites of Guatemala, the economic elites of Guatemala, that created a unity for these different sectors to come together to sort of put the kibosh on this entire anti-impunity. And that's where we are in Guatemala now. I'm happy to take any questions, hear any of your feedback or comments. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm going to give you the opportunity to talk about the backlash.
Do you want me to take a few questions and I'll...
Yeah, we'll collect a few questions. This is how it works at a scholarly conference. You collect a few questions and then the speaker responds.
I'm Erin. I've always been curious. So you said that you've sat in trial with some of these people. Have they ever showed any remorse? Like whether it's genuine or not? Have they ever showed any remorse for all the shit they did?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about specifically, you talked about the malicious litigation and those kind of practices. I just wanted to know if it's not, a crazy amount of time to explain that kind of stuff, or if we see those kinds of practices, is that unique to this situation, or is that more something we see usually with this kind of thing?
Good question.
I think
Sorry, what was your name?
Tyler.
Tyler, thanks. Okay, great. Those are great questions. I don't need the microphone.
no, you're well mic'd.
Good. I'm going to start with the second question. It's the easier one. Erin's question: did any, in the course of my trial, and I've been observing trials since 2007. I started kind of, I really wasn't planning to become a trial observer and spend years researching these issues. I was a researcher of political violence. and human rights. But the guy I had researched, Alberto Fujimori, the former dictator of Peru, had been extradited from Chile and was going on trial. And I thought, oh, I just really have to go see that. And so I sat in the first week of his trial and I was like mesmerized. And that is sort of what got me hooked. And probably I'm a little bit of a masochist because sitting in trials can be incredibly boring, right? A lot of times nothing happens. A lot of times you go all the way to the courtroom only to find out that the defendant is claiming an illness and the court has to cancel the hearing, or they're discussing some little detail, or they're filing a legal motion that is meaningless and just meant to delay and, obstruct and so forth. So I had my Sudoku with me at all times, really, because it can be really boring, but it can also be incredibly fascinating at the same time, right? Because you're seeing play out, history is playing out right before your eyes. And people are talking about their different understandings of what happened, right? Fujimori's version versus the victim's version, Rios Montt's version versus the Ixil community's version. There's obviously more versions than that, right? But did anyone ever express remorse? 99% no, at all. On the contrary, especially the senior military officials, they are highly ideological, highly identified with the military as an institution, highly believe in their mission, or you believe that they believe in their mission, I'm not sure which, and defend to the death their actions. They'll couch it in certain terms. They'll say there were excesses, there weren't really systematic human rights violations, right? We did what we had to do to save the country, because after all, these were terrorists, these were communists, these were Marxists. We were defending them. Not that Guatemala was a democracy, mind you, but right, that's what they'll say. I have seen a couple of occasions, once in Peru, one low-ranking official sort of expressed remorse because he had already confessed to his crime and then he fled the country. And so he thought he was fine. And he was living in Miami. He was found by ICE. This was way back before ICE became what it is today. I guess it wasn't, it was probably back then. And he was extradited back to Peru on trial. And in that context, he was remorseful, but he had already confessed. He knew he was already going to be convicted, and he was convicted. So other than that,
And he was remorseful because it affected him personally.
I think he was being accused by the other military officials on trial with him, including his senior officials, his commanding officers, who were accusing him of being the only one responsible for the massacre. It was a massacre that occurred in 1985 in Peru, 69 peasants, called the Ajomarca massacre. And he was really angry that they were blaming him. And so he then started accusing his senior officials. So you told me to do this, you issued this order, you told me to go kill those eyewitnesses, and so forth. In that context, he expressed remorse. It was very intense. But other than that, there have been a few cases also of mid-level perpetrators who turn state's evidence. In other words, they give, and not all legal systems allow this, but Peru does, and to a certain extent, Guatemala does. So in exchange for providing useful and meaningful information to help prosecutors go after more senior officials, the most responsible, they might get a reduced sentence or a more lenient sentence. And sometimes I've seen those kinds of people express remorse, but it's very rare. It's very rare. Malicious litigation is not at all unique to Guatemala. It's just very practiced there. I think it's used in a lot of places. Generally, I'm not a lawyer, just to be clear, right? But generally, a legal system has safeguards to prevent malicious litigation from leading things off the rails. But we do see it here as well. And I'm not going to name the person who's the biggest, most egregious user of malicious litigation, but I bet you know who I'm talking about. Okay. So it is used in a lot of other places, but ideally you are developing, like I said, safeguards to prevent that from becoming so dominant that it undermines your legal process and the rule of law. Because otherwise you're going down the Guatemala path where it all just like kind of explodes. So thank you, Paul. You gave me the opportunity to talk about the backlash. Essentially, and unfortunately, remember I talked about those 2015 protests where people came out into the streets massively to protest government corruption, state-sanctioned corruption involving the president, involving the vice president, involving several government ministers, like 200 people were arrested and put on trial as a result of the investigations into that state corruption. And so he was removed from office. An interim president came in, and there were elections like literally a couple months after that. But the Guatemalan political system there had not been the kind of reforms needed in the Guatemalan political system for us to get a candidate who would be like the reform candidate. So instead, you got a guy who was on the payroll of the military, right? He was a former television comedian. No real ideology. He was just I mean, I hate to use this word, he's just a stooge. His name was Jimmy Morales. He was elected president and he became the front man for the destruction of the CICIG. His sole job was to get rid of CICIG. That's why he was put in office. That's why the military backed him. The military and the oligarchy, I should say, not just the military, because later on, CICIG would investigate the oligarchy for illegal campaign contributions to his campaign. So you get this kind of unholy alliance, right, between the military, who's upset about these war crimes trials, the oligarchy that's increasingly upset by CICIG's investigations into some of its wrongdoings, right? And it creates like the perfect storm, right? And one thing that they realized is that they had lost control over the justice sector. They still controlled the executive, they still controlled the Congress, but they lost control of the courts and of the prosecutor's office. So their first step was to get rid of CICIG. Well, that was probably their third or fourth step because they'd done some things before that, but they got rid of CICIG. Then they made sure that they replaced the independent attorney general with a sycophant. And that was in 2018. They appointed Consuelo Porras to be the attorney general. She is still the attorney general to this day, almost 8 years later. And she led the campaign to and false investigations is not what I want to say. Spurious investigations, right? Into independent prosecutors, independent judges, independent journalists, human rights leaders. And so people in her own office who had been working side by side with CICIG, conducting these key investigations into corruption, the people who got the former president, Otto Perez Molina, arrested in 2015, fired, and then forced into exile. Right, so they slowly started co-opting and taking over the justice sector. Right, and soon they had control over all branches of government. And then the civic space started closing in. Right. By a miracle in 2023, there were elections and an anti-corruption candidate won. It was absolutely a miracle. The problem is when he came to office, the attorney general connected with that corrupt pact, what they call the pact of the corrupt in Guatemala. She's still in office. And he, many people said to him, the first thing you need to do is to fire her. He says, well, I can't really fire her unless there's cause, and I don't really know that I have cause. So I'm going to have the Congress. I'm going to kick this, hot potato over to the Congress and the Congress is run by mostly these corrupt officials. And so she's still there 2 years into his administration. She's still there. She's still the independent prosecutor's office and investigating war crimes trials was amazingly still intact until 2024. In 2024, she fired the lead prosecutors and put in someone, an ally of hers, someone who, like her, was sanctioned by the US government using the Engels legislation that we have to sanction corrupt and anti-democratic officials. So right now, there is still space, I think, for Guatemala to come out of this hole, but the space is shrinking because the president, the guy who was elected in 2023, Bernardo Arevalo, who happens to be the son of the guy who led the Democratic Spring in 1944, Juan Jose Arevalo, right? The window is closing on him, but there's still maybe some opportunities, right? There is right now, Guatemalans are gearing up for the process by which a new attorney general is going to be appointed. And people like me believe that it will be impossible for him to reappoint her, even though the Pact of the Corrupt wants her to be reappointed. How he's going to do that, and how he'll resist the pressure to do that, and also to appoint someone who is honest and who will be a good attorney general, that remains to be seen. Because he's got a lot of pressures now, a lot of pressures. So it's a lot longer story than that, but that's kind of a quick summary. Thank you for the questions.
Could you comment on the state of Israel's role in these years of genocide? Thank you, and connect that with international law if you can.
I don't know if I can do that, but yeah, it's very well known that so during the Carter years, when human rights became a central piece of U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. government cut back on military aid partly because legislation had been passed by Congress, right? That in theory, right, prevents the United States from providing military and other forms of aid to governments that engage in human rights abuses. So several governments in Latin America were cut off from U.S. assistance, including Argentina, for example, and including Guatemala. In the case of Guatemala, I don't know about Argentina, but in the case of Guatemala, it's well known, well documented, the government of Israel stepped in and provided military assistance, aid, training to the Guatemalan military at the height of the genocide. The U.S. ramped up its assistance in Guatemala once Reagan became president. In fact, there's a famous scene in a film. I think it's a film by Pamela Yates, an American filmmaker who's done several really good documentaries about Guatemala, in which you see Ronald Reagan having a press conference with Rios Montt, and Rios Montt comes on stage, he's dressed all in white, and Reagan says something like, "Oh, this is the guy who's gotten a bum rap on human rights," just completely dismissing the accusations of genocide and human rights abuses under Rios Montt. And so aid is reinstated under Reagan. But there was a period where Israeli assistance to Guatemala was and in the context of what's going on right now, this is discussed quite a bit in Guatemala these days. In terms of international, I don't know. I don't really have a comment. I don't know what I would say about that, but it's a very well-known fact. Thank you for that question.